This is Ahval Online, meeting point of accurate news and free comment on the current affairs of Turkey. Welcome to our podcast series.
Hello, dear Ahval listeners. This is Yektan Ahval editor. Today we will talk about the Idlib attack on Turkish military posts in northern Syria in a coordinated attack by Russia and Syrian Air Force. As you know, 33 soldiers were killed in this attack. However, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdoğan announced today that the death toll is in fact 36. So we will discuss this with a guest from Forum Transregionale Studien, Yektan Türkyılmaz. He's a researcher at that forum. Mr. Türkyılmaz, welcome to our program.
Hi, how are you?
Thank you. You know that the escalation was very high yesterday night in Idlib. And Turkey is undergoing a huge crisis and turmoil in terms of its relation with the neighbors, with Russia, and even with NATO. So, how do you evaluate this attack, and what do you expect to happen in the near future?
So, first of all, of course, it is difficult to predict the course of a violent conflict. We are talking about a violent conflict here in Syria. But, Turkish troops getting involved in a confrontation, an unplanned confrontation, is not surprising if you take into consideration the diplomatic and political course of the leadership. I would say an important turning point was October 9th, 2019. That is the day that Turkish army kicked off an incursion into northern Syria, or Rojava. That is the areas controlled by the Syrian Democratic Forces. And I think that I argue that marks the moment that Turkish regime turns into a war regime. That is a regime which deems its survival, which deems its survival without hostile involvement in, let's say, or war making abroad, and it was an open-ended military incursion, and since then we have seen Turkish involvement, increased Turkish military involvement, not only in Syria but also in Libya, in Eastern Mediterranean. So I think this policy it seems to me as difficult to reverse, a process difficult to reverse, because I think what fuels the aggression on part of the current Turkish regime is this irrecoverable rift between the vulnerabilities of the regime and the imperial grandiose self-image of the elites. That is to say, if you look at the recent history of Turkey, especially the Turkish politics since the coup attempt in 2016, there is an interesting process. As the Turkish regime or as the Turkish state gets weaker, the program or the policies of the regime gets more and more aggressive. So and more ambitious at the same time. So this is actually what happened in Idlib is one of the an outcome of this kind of diplomacy, this kind of foreign policy. Yet it could have been. I mean, Turkey could have potentially have a similar encounter with even with the troops of a NATO ally, that is United States, in northern Syria. I mean, it was, Turkey came to this, very close to this, like, this and a violent encounter many times, which have been, barely avoided. So, and now we are, we're at a point that obviously the Turkish foreign policy crashed or hit to a rock, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. So you mean that this the course of Turkish foreign policy was in a way unavoidable. I mean, escalation, military engagements abroad, even in Libya. Can we also consider that Libya is also part of this game, or the one-man cult's results that Turkey has to face? What do you think?
Obviously, apparently, and it's not that I deem this as inevitable. Let me clarify that, but but rather not surprising. That this kind of this unilateral maximalist foreign policy of the current Erdoğan regime could have potentially created this such a disastrous outcome before, and as of yesterday, it did so. So Libya, yes, definitely, and also we shouldn't also forget the escalation in Eastern Mediterranean, especially around Cyprus. So these are all parts of this bigger picture, which is that there's an elite in Turkey which deems itself, which deems itself as an imperial power or wannabe imperial power, which actually resorts to a supremacist rhetoric in its approach to the region or to the conflicts. So yes, definitely, Libya is part of this, but what is particularly interesting here is the kind of political course that the regime elite, especially the leadership, followed since 2015. I think that tells us so much about what is happening in Turkey and what might happen next.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But on the other hand, Erdoğan is trying to both not losing, at least, let's say, both NATO and Russia. And is this a balanced policy, or is this something to use one one against another? For instance, as you remember, Turkey bought S-400 missiles from Russia, an act which was harshly condemned and opposed by the NATO. However, Turkey continued to say that it's decisive and it will also launch these missiles and will use it in its soils. But after the Idlib attack, Turkey also turned its face to the US and NATO, demanded Patriot missile systems to be launched against Syrian targets in the border city, maybe in Hatay. So how do you evaluate this inconsistent policy, a conflicting view of foreign policy?
I will get to that question, but I think as much interesting is how they are trying to do so. We will address. I partly address, but I want to come to that question again. But how they do it is quite striking because it is. I think the Turkish leadership showing signs of incapacity or reluctance to perceive a dialogical relationship with international actors whom they disagree with. In a way, it would be, I think, relevant to say that, I mean, there is a decay of communication and relationality skills. So actually, Turkish side keeps hearing what favors their position. I mean, they kind of shy away from, or avoid, disregard anything that doesn't fit their worldview, their expectations, their policies. So that takes us to another big problem in Turkish foreign policy. Apparently, let's look at, for instance, the kind of relationship they have had, the Turkish regime had with the Russian, with Russia since 2015, November 2015, when Turkish airplanes shot down a Russian warplane, either just on the border or on the Syrian, or around the border between Turkey and Syria. And all of a sudden, we thought that Turkey is going to, I mean, it was another moment like yesterday that we thought that these two countries are at the brink of a war or a violent confrontation. But then in September 2016, there was an unexpected, a sudden rapprochement between the two parties, and Erdoğan went as far as to say, "Gavaryu izvinite," that is, I say, I'm sorry, or I apologize for what happened. Basically, it's very unusual. I mean, we have to remind the listeners here that this is, Turkish leadership apologizing is probably unheard of. And that rapprochement continued, and then it come to the extent that Turkey's alliance with Russia began to kind of replace its strategic alliance with NATO, for which has been created after decades long efforts of both sides. And it did, the purchase of S-400 system was, I think, the epitome of this moment, that that these two countries are becoming kind of regional and perhaps a long-term ally. But if you look at the agendas of the parties, especially in Syria, you can do it also in Libya, that there is a mismatch. So, the tension here is you basically put aside your strategic allies, that is the NATO allies, and replace it, whom you accuse for not favoring or not supporting Turkey's position, and then set up an alliance with another major regional power, interestingly, with whom your agenda does not necessarily match either. So, and if you look, if you ask the question, but why then they would do that? I think it's obvious for the Turkish regime that they cannot pursue their dreams, or they cannot continue their adventures in Syria without Russian, let's say, alliance, or without the approval of Russians. This is very obvious, and I think to continue to be a player in Syria, Turkish regime feels that it's obliged to. to continue its relations with Putin regime. And meanwhile, another thing happened, which is Turkish side forcibly urged United States to leave Syria. You would probably recall it, especially like around the crisis, around the conflict, about the confrontation over northern Syria, or that's the Kurdish control areas of Syria. The Turkish side repeatedly called on the US forces to leave the country. And then they buy and meanwhile they buy the S-400 system, they activate it, and then this crisis comes out, and then they call the US and the NATO back. So the first observation we would have seeing this picture is that, first of all, Turkey lacks a strategic policy. Despite its increased activity abroad, it doesn't have a strategic vision in any of these conflicts. Mm-hmm. I mean, this is, if you put these items one by one, shooting down the Russian plane and then apologizing, forcing the US and NATO forces out, and repeatedly calling them as enemies and responsible for the coup, and then allow Moscow to capitalize on the country's vital military and economic capabilities, and then come into a collision course with Russia and almost declare war against Russia's Assad. I mean, no one could find any logic here. I mean, but because there is no strategy and there is no vision, there is the desire, there is the aspiration of supremacy, of imperial vision, of grandeurs, but Ankara definitely lacks any long-term vision. They just impulsively react to immediate or upcoming crisis. But what it does, this policy does, is then that impulsive response puts the country in further trouble in the longer run. So it's in a way,
mm-hmm. Yeah. I think this also serves to Russia's interest, because since the US left northern Syria, Turkey couldn't get any benefit or couldn't reach any target regarding Syria in terms of creating the safety region to transfer those Syrian immigrants living in Turkey, the number which might be around 4 million. So none of these targets were could be applied in the field, I think, under the observation of Russia since then. What do you think?
Obviously, and it is quite interesting that the Turkish side could hope that they could pursue alliance with Putin despite Russia's strategic investment in the survival of the Assad regime and its gaining control all over Syria. So it's kind of, there's a major tension here, and Turkish side, I think, underestimates to what extent Putin likes playing the hardball in foreign policy. I mean, they can briefly look at the recent couple of recent episodes during the Putin period, Putin's term. they can easily just briefly look at what happened in Georgia, Ukraine, and Crimea eventually. So, and one can increase these examples. The kind of threatening, aggressive unilateralism that Turkish side has often used against the EU, European Union, the NATO, even to their strategic allies, the US, probably will not work with Putin. And I don't think that at this point, the Russian side wants further escalation. Yet, if you look at, they just want to probably de-escalate the situation at this point, but also reminding the Turkish side that what they cannot do, what they shouldn't do, and also what the Sochi agreement or what the previous, let's say, agreements and negotiations stipulate or burdens the Turkish side to do. So yes.
Mm-hmm. From your perspective, what anyone can expect from the relations of Turkey and Russia in a near future, because you said that Russia taught a lesson, in fact, to Turkey.
They wanted to, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, regarding the limitations of Turkey's capability in Syria. So, what do you say?
I mean, it would be, unless Turkey goes to a dramatic change in its foreign policy, especially its policy regarding Syria and Assad regime, it would be very unlikely to expect the relations between Russia and the Turkey and the Turkish regime be a durable one, a long-term one. Mm-hmm. And yet, the irony here is that Turkish side is well aware that without Russia as being somewhat on the Turkish side, their adventures in Syrian territories is by and large over. That's not doable. And it's not only doable in Idlib, but also Afrin. And also parts of northern Syria. So, and I doubt if the Turkish side or the Turkish regime is ready to give up and its control over those territories, and this insistence might cost Turkey as a country altogether really dearly.
Mm-hmm. Finally, I want to ask whether Turkey's ask for help of NATO is a pragmatic move, or again, Turkey is changing its course. I mean, its drive and turning its face to its former ally, not NATO and the US, or just, as I said, a pragmatic move to put pressure on Russia?
First of all, Turkish side makes this request at a time when it has the least leverage against the West, against the NATO, against the United States. So another thing is, just recall what happened the previous year not previous year, like a couple of months ago, actually, in October 2019, that the Trump administration declared that they do not want to really be involved in the Syrian affairs or Syrian crisis anymore. Then they changed their mind, this and that. But obviously, neither NATO nor the American government wants to get militaristically as a military force. They do not want to get involved in the Syria crisis anyway. So and for Turkey is unreliable, and also taking into consideration Turkey's unpredictable and reckless moves, I think that makes it further unlikely for such actors to run to Turkey's help. But of course, they will say, "Oh, we support you. We are in solidarity." But I don't think this will turn into anything. This would bring out anything that the Turkish side wants to see. Meanwhile, this lack of this decay of relationality and communication skills is again popping up. I mean, like this decision to open the doors to refugees, open the borders so that they can flood into Europe is, I think, a great example of this decay. The Turkish side cannot communicate. And this kind of fundamentalist and preemptory approach in an maximalist unilateral approach is not sustainable in the long run. And yes, as we know, for a while, the Turkish government has been using this refugee issue as a weapon. But if you look at this, this, what kind of a weapon is this? Yes, it might, if Turkey opens the borders, if let millions of refugees flood into Europe, this might hurt European governments. But that would be definitely a suicidal move on part of Turkey. What I'm trying to say is, it seems to me that, that the Turkish side is not anywhere close to changing its reckless course. It continues with the similar pattern that is it's unilateral maximalism in rhetoric and audaciousness in their deeds. And this is an unsustainable position, not even in the very long run. I think in very even in the near future, this will keep creating troubles to the country, to the regime, to the old other parties, not only to Turkey but also other parties involved in these conflicts.
Okay, Mr. Türkyılmaz, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.
You can follow Ahval News Online podcast series through Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, Google Podcasts, SoundCloud, and Spreaker. All you need to know about Turkey is here, for your ears, mind, and attention. Thank you for listening to our podcast.